Submachine is a series of small point-and-click room escape games that take the player on a sci-fi journey through a broken world where machines have built their own environments and structures far beyond human control. Your job is to pick through these structures and find some way of escaping, and you do this by following in the footsteps of several people who were here before you, and have also explored or directly contributed to the degradation of this bizarre universe of indeterminate location, size, and dimensionality. There are 10 games in the main series, along with 4 side games that were released between 2005 and 2015, 2017 if you count expansion updates. And there's also now a card game that released this year. I got in on Submachine properly around 2012 or 2013, quickly realizing that this was a hyperfixation that would dominate all my others. I could not get enough of this world. Fan art, fan fiction, theories about what the big overarching story was really all about. Editing the Submachine wiki so thoroughly that I eventually was poised to administrate the whole thing, and importantly, spending time writing thousands of posts on the fan forum for all of developer Mateusz Skutnik's works. Between all of these things, it's safe to say that I immediately filled the community with my presence, and I filled my free time in turn with this game that I simply wanted to be immersed in forever. It's a community that occupies its own small corner of the internet too, which means that the number of active fans was never that big, but it did mean that we were passionate. We created our own satellite lores and stories for the community itself, and Mateusz Skutnik, at the center of his own little world, did everything that he could to nurture this continuing story and hype of this perpetual party for this wonderful game series full of places to explore and items to use and beautifully digitally drawn architecture to gawk at and deliciously cosmic horror to ponder as well. He brought this perpetual mystique to all of it, being simultaneously extremely accessible as another member in the community that chatted with us about whatever, but also withdrawing into this vaguer persona as the architect of the mysterious world, who may or may not hold the answers to all of the questions we still had. And it clearly was a huge deal when people were so interested in his work that they were starting to use their new YouTube channel to do Let's Plays of his games, or taking inspiration from channels like Markiplier or the Game Theorists to start making Submachine theories in video form, or putting on even the Tyler McVicker hat and just generating media tracking what he was doing. I was doing all of these things because Submachine was just that interesting to me, and as a result of Skutnik appreciating how much I was giving his work prominence, we had this special sort of pen-pal connection form. I'm not saying this to sound parasocial for no reason. We both want to meet up with each other, which has been difficult to do when he's in Poland and I'm in the United States, but we chat every so often. He has sent me Polish chocolates before. I feel like I need to disclose this before I offer my thoughts on Submachine Legacy. Not just so that people know that I have a bias, but so people fully understand bias. People need to fully understand what it's like to so completely take the time to understand what an artist has been trying to tell us as a storyteller in their work. I am talking about a story that is deeply part of a conversation that I and others have been having for years. This is a game coming from a community where I've been able to freely talk with people from other countries, which eventually turned into regular Discord calls, and even in some cases led to spending time with them in real life, and genuine friendships and connections that lasted for years. This is a piece of culture that I hope to share with all of the new friends that I make, a game that I want to watch all of them experience because it's that core to me. It's all tied together by Submachine. And let's talk about Submachine, before Submachine Legacy came along. For all the videos that I've made, including the ones that I've deleted and including some of the ones that I've re-uploaded, I've never really tackled talking about Submachine head-on and what I just generally think about it. I've gotten close. I made a video where I was frustrated that the story was never fully coming together. That was the closest I ever got to looking at the series as a whole. It's a series of games where each installment provides some answers and introduces even more questions. We know that we're exploring an environment originally built by human design, but how big is it? Are we above or below ground? Are we in space? Are we in some other sort of virtual mathematical construction? Are we inside or outside? What is inside the core of the subnet? Where is the outside of the subnet? Why is everything lit up with bright lights if we're surrounded by pitch black void? Where is the light coming from? How does physics work here? Why are some things floating? Where is everyone? What does it mean for people to disappear into different layers of reality? What was the subnet originally built for? Who built it? Is the subnet apart from the rest of Earth? Or is it subsumed part of it? Are we even still on planet Earth at all? What really distinguishes green karma energy from blue karma energy? It has been simultaneously extremely intriguing and incredibly frustrating at times to secure answers to all of these questions. A lot of them can be answered with reasonable certainty if you take the time to play through the games enough, and have reasoned discussions with other fans, or ask Mataush himself for clarifying questions. Sometimes he will spill his secrets. We've been trying to put all the puzzle pieces in place for the longest time, adding to a puzzle that seems to always expand its borders. We are trying to solve the world being given to us.
Now, this theorizing thing, though, really only works if there's actually a deeper story to be told, and if the story and game world itself don't have internal contradictions. It would be a lot harder to learn about our universe if the laws of physics and space-time that seem to govern it could be broken. The same applies to movies, too, which also make up a big part of media critique culture, just like games do. And when you have a piece of media that purposefully hides its inner workings from the audience, it's harder to tell if there actually is a cohesive story to find underneath all of the layers and obscurity that some games have.
For the longest time, Submachine has existed as two gaming experiences. First, the game that's concerned with picking up the items and solving the puzzles to slowly make your way to the exit. And second, the meta game of building the complete picture of the world that Mataush Skutnik has painted bit by bit for us. We look to understand as much as possible from it, and he's fostered this himself by giving us an entire game in the series, Submachine Universe, that exists to showcase how real-world people have written down their attempts to answer these many questions throughout the years, myself included. And some of us take the time to determine whether or not we accept or reject its form based on what we know. In the past, I adopted the framework that said, if all of these details don't point to a fully complete and logical picture with zero contradictions or plot holes, then this game is at fault for that, and I choose to evaluate it based on that. I don't do that anymore. I don't have all the answers figured out yet, partially because my experience with Submachine has already shifted many times between feeling like I have a solid grasp on it and feeling like I don't really know anything at the end of the day. Common experience if you talk to another Submachine fan. Sometimes it's difficult to conceptualize what this world's form actually looks like and what exactly happened when. Sometimes it's easier to accept it just as the story of a man who became caught up too much in his own passions of science and exploration and became secluded from everyone else, and his actions caused ripple effects and catastrophes that he couldn't fully understand until those who knew him best opened his eyes and allowed him to reconnect with the rest of us and rebuild for a better future. That's basically the plot if you boil it down enough. It feels like even if we know all of these fine details of the world and the events that transpired, it's really difficult to put them all together in a good summary, which is why people keep asking for resources on a summary of Submachine's story, and why it's been difficult to make one after all this time. Not for lack of trying. What it seems I learned most from exploring the story of Submachine is not how necessarily good or consistent the story is, which is not to say that the story is not those things, but that the greatest value to be extracted is that of the story being told in the first place and the effects that it has had on us. I think that probably sounds like a cop-out to a lot of people. Of course, we want a good story that's built out of more than just the friends we made along the way. We'd like to hope that a story told by someone who really holds up his storytelling ability as what makes him who he is satisfying in ways that go just beyond the satisfaction of having something to be entertained by. To fully talk about this more might mean that I'll be seeing you in the comments, but what I can say is that throughout all of the theories, questions and answers, and mysteries, it has really been a wonderful story about discovery, about feeling alone in the face of a world that doesn't make any sense, about the duality of both stress and intense interests of dealing with the unknown, and about what it means to create something and lose your grasp on it, and being conscious about the effect that it has on others. There's more to it than that, but simply put, we cannot deny that there is something there that's worth holding on to, and I do not believe that those messages are impeded by any logical inconsistencies or holes that might present themselves. So that's generally the story part, and I think I also have to speak to or pitch the setting and the gameplay of Submachine as well. Let's talk about the setting first. This is a game that I think originally got so popular because people could tell that Skutnik had plans to take the Flash platform and bend it to his will so that he could create some of the coolest looking adventure games out there. It took a few games for the Submachine aesthetic to be established. I wasn't there for it in 2005, but I don't think anyone was necessarily fawning over these graphics from the original Submachine 1. But it definitely did get established. Submachine 2 helped a lot, and it's extremely interesting to see how his interests in designing different parts of the subnet had shifted over time. The earlier games are very focused on the basic architecture of places reminiscent of what we know, meaning Western residential dwellings or office-based structures or assorted public utility buildings, a basement with wood panel walls, a lighthouse, a laboratory, lots of electromechanical objects to play with. A lot of stuff of industry, things that are reminiscent of humans finding their footing in a built-up industrial society. And as the games go on and the story gets more cerebral and focused on higher orders of philosophy, the environments get less mechanical and more spiritually informed, discovering places of worship from other cultures, religious iconography, and an increasing obsession with the spatially and geometrically divine. As Skutnik's drawn screens become more complex, he clearly is bending Flash 2 as well, as I said, but also the platform itself still offers a slightly constricting guidance where all of these things feel still somewhat primordial and raw. The line art and simpler polygons that form the root of this style are always there. And Mateusz is a student of architecture, and you can see a passion for it everywhere in how he forces you to explore every nook and cranny of these environments, forcing you to just rub your nose in the paneling and the bricks and the mortar and the stone everywhere you click. Whether it's in the more functional environments or the ones that are built to commemorate the top excesses of human ingenuity, you will enjoy bricks and mortar when you get out of here. You will never look at it the same way again. But his architectural background doesn't mean that he's building, the subnet is building, all of these areas to specifications with engineering precision, interestingly enough, as if it's concerned with how real-world people are fitting into all these places. First of all, notice how the screen is taking place in a 1-to-1 aspect ratio. That is incredibly tight, but the point is you have to focus on everything in the room at once, because these games have you click from room to room instead of the traditional turning to face one wall at a time like you would in other room escape games. We're going places in this world, my friend. We're not just staying in one spot. And this means that you're seeing everything at once, so you see the walls, the floor, and the ceiling in foreshortened proportions, and the items within do not stick to their real-world proportional sizes. This allowed things to pop better in a screen space that was originally only 300 pixels squared. But it also contributes to this existential feeling that this place is not exactly built for us anymore, and we have lost our grip on all of the things that we have created throughout the centuries. So now we either have to figure out how to fix all of that, or just escape and leave it all behind. It's a wonderful aesthetic that is fun to see expanded on game after game, because each game brings in new objects from new places and new time periods. The subnet really does work to try to envelop everything about what we as humans have built, what we as humans can create that situates us properly in the real world. And I think it's just really neat to see someone go all in on an appreciation for the built form in that sense. And then there are the puzzles. The three main aspects of Submachine, its puzzles, the built environment, and the stories contained within, not very easy to separate from each other, but the puzzles themselves are perhaps the easiest to tease out because they largely are the least special out of the three. That's not to say they're bad by any means, in fact, and I do try to say this without 13 years of gameplay permanently altering my brain. The puzzles, for the most part, are pretty fair, I think, requiring no huge leaps of logic or trial and error to solve, just maybe a bit of patience, maybe a bit of classical pixel hunting, just pay attention where your mouse is going. That being said, the puzzle solving you'll be doing in Submachine is pretty ordinary because the overwhelming majority of the puzzles take the form of finding an item and figuring out where to put that item to access another area or another item. And the puzzle comes from being able to observe the environment and figure out where each item is supposed to go. There are some classical room escape game puzzles to be found, and some of the games switch it up and force you to treat the entire installment like a huge puzzle box where you have to look at the game as a whole to really figure out what's going on. But largely it's a situation where you find an item and figure out where it's supposed to go by paying attention to the design of the item and the world around you. Simple key and lock setup. What makes Submachine and also other games by Mateusz Skutnik unique is how committed it is to this mechanic. By the time you get to Submachine 10, there are so many items that you're picking up and inserting into other things that you should have long ago started asking the question, why are all of these items just scattered around the world like this in the first place? And how convenient is it that you're able to get all the ones that you need? Especially once you start adding what the lore has to say about the exploration teams that were here before you, and were doing pretty much the same puzzles you were doing as an explicit test of their abilities. This sort of puzzle is not exactly complex, which means that it could be quite a turnoff for anyone who decides they're not invested in this repeated interplay between the puzzles and the world of Subnet. It's a marathon of the same type of puzzle mechanic, and I do wonder if that makes it one of the main contributing factors as to why Submachine never got really popular. I mean, by the time you get to Submachine 10, you're given a whole backpack to expand your inventory space. Over the course of Submachine 10, when I first played it, just like in the rest of the games, when I learned how focused the gameplay was on this one specific mechanic, and how the motions became so distilled and centering on getting items, open up new areas, more items, it actually did make me wonder if the entire Submachine experience now was being simplified too much, just giving the barest bones possible of this puzzle setup. This was a great thing to have properly visualized for us when a community member showed us how the Submachine puzzles could be mapped onto dungeon graphs, a concept formed by Mark Brown of Game Maker's Toolkit. The whole experience becomes very mechanical, and I think if these items and their respective locks were not so intimately married with the environments they were found in, they might come across as just this sort of BS mechanic that you have to deal with in order to see the next cool thing or learn the next piece of information. And of course, we also can't forget the experience of what it's like to miss an item somewhere in the labyrinth of rooms, which means that eventually your progression will come to a halt, and then you'll have to start backtracking for the thing you missed, and that's when the real frustration will start to set in. Because of course, that's the nature of these puzzle games. Every item has only one, maybe sometimes two uses, and everything that needs to be done in turn can only be done by one special thing. No one that I know of is designing point-and-click room escape games that allow players to be resourceful and creative without bound and come up with multiple solutions or item usages when it comes to figuring out how to progress past something in our way. And Submachine is definitely no exception. If you don't have the thing you need to progress, Submachine offers no help on where to look, not even a hint. That's when you are most reminded that these beautiful and intriguing rooms you've been exploring, the hundreds of them, are still not there to ease you along. It's a cold and unforgiving world out there in the subnet. Submachine 10 The Exit provides the pinnacle of this feeling in the main series, but Submachine Universe, the side game, really pushes this concept to its limit. See, Submachine Universe also has a lot of items and puzzles that you have to keep track of, but they're also spread out over 120 different locations, each of which has a unique 3-number code that you have to remember if you want to go back there. Or alternatively, these locations can only be reached from one of those 3-number coded locations by a portal, so you have to remember what location those portal accessed locations are tied to, and what is in each location that you might be able to interact with. Of course, this teleporter allows you to put in any 3 numbers you want, but not all of the combinations will send you somewhere. From the way I'm describing it, this sounds impossible to keep track of, and if you don't have a pen and paper, it very well might be. I've completed Submachine Universe probably upwards of 10 or 15 times in full, and each successive run does not make it that much easier. And I still, every so often, will be doing a run and collecting items and clues to figure out where I have to go next, and I'll be 90% of the way to the end when suddenly I can't use anything in my inventory anymore. And all the partial clues and equations I've assembled on my piece of paper don't give me any more 3-number location codes to try, and I have no idea what I missed, and I have to reluctantly turn back towards the 100 or so locations I've explored for the past few hours and figure out where to backtrack first. It's brutal. It's actually sadistic. And that's the point. No hard feelings of this description of Submachine Universe makes you want to run far away from it, but you have to understand that through this puzzle experience, you get the absolute best sense of how expansive this fictional universe really is. Submachine promises you a hugely expansive world full of weird places to explore, laid out in a fashion that makes it seem like a completely unrestrained growth with almost no rhyme or reason, where it's very easy to get lost immediately, and this demonstrates it perfectly. And Mateusz clearly enjoys this overcommitment to the item and lock mechanic because This core puzzle designing method is also featured heavily in his first game on Steam, Slice of Sea. And there, the items that you need were also joined by plenty of items that you could pick up that had no use to help you progress. They're just trivial, so be glad that you're not at least dealing with that. But still, all that being said, I'm gonna say this too. The puzzles you have to solve in Submachine Universe are kind of bullshit. You have to crawl every part of the screen to make sure you find absolutely everything. You have to seek 3-number combinations everywhere, whether shown simply on plates or distorted with other characters in between, or encoded in Roman numerals. Hopefully you know those. Or you have to start adding them and subtracting them from other numbers you find. They're hidden in notes, they're hidden in math equations, they're hidden in shapes everywhere. Some of them you have to assemble number by paying attention to colored plates spread across 3 different locations. You will have to mouse over some parts of the environment that don't look like they can be interacted with. You will feel forced to treat everything as though it can be potentially a clue to help you move forward. And technically speaking, almost none of the things you need to do require leaps in logic, so they're not technically bullshit, but with the weight of everything you have to keep track of and double check, there still is a very high chance that something as seemingly innocent as the letter C will make you shut the entire game down and never touch it again. It tests the limits of human patience and mental fortitude. It's insane. And for that reason, Submachine Universe is my favorite game in the Submachine series. Every so often I ask myself what my favorite Submachine game is, and it's always difficult to choose because I love all of them so much, even Ancient Adventure. But thematically, Submachine Universe is in a lot of ways the most Submachine-like of them all. There really is no gaming experience like it in the rest of the series, and I don't think there's a gaming experience like it in all of video games. So yeah, that about does it for describing the puzzles in Submachine, and keep in mind, they're not all like Submachine Universe, that one's just a special extreme example. I just felt the need to highlight it because in many ways that game is the crown jewel in the entire collection. So the puzzles join the story and the environment in this basic 3-part analysis of Submachine, and the bulk of why I think this is worth checking out. But there is a 4th part that is going to be pretty relevant when we move on soon, I swear, to Submachine Legacy. I also have to talk about how Mateusz Skutnik has used Submachine to record his own creative process, and more specifically, has made his process of creating Submachine part of the Submachine world itself. We got a sneak peek of this when I talked about how Mateusz would simultaneously serve as just another community member in a lot of respects, but he also would adopt the persona hiding behind the letter M in his posts, just as one of the game characters does, when fans speculate about what might be happening in the Submachine games. He takes a lot of chances that he can get to incorporate changes in his creative process for Submachine into Submachine itself. We can actually go right back to Submachine Universe for some notable examples. Late in the game's development, after it was pointed out that a couple locations had their coordinates hinted at in 2 separate places, rather than removing the second clue completely, Mateusz simply took the text of the clue away from the plate that they were found on, but he left the plate in its spot, and there's a new message that's now found there reading, unreadable, query, unrecognized language. Location 291 is another noteworthy instance. When Submachine Universe first released in 2010, it was only 50 locations large in size, only, with other locations being added over the next 7 years. 291 was one of the original 50, and it ended up being reused in Submachine 7 The Core, which was released 6 months later. After Sub 7 was released, the version of the location in Submachine Universe was updated to show signs of the alterations that were made in Submachine 7. What this did was essentially make Submachine Universe suddenly exist in multiple periods of time, which sort of suggests this alignment with our own timeline. This sense of a new time dimension developing was also supported by almost every new location accessed by Karma Portal in Submachine Universe. It could have been one thing to just add Karma Portals as another thing to interact with, but most of the new Karma Portals fracture their surroundings, which implies different things for the time that Subverse exists in, given what we know about the whereabouts of the person most likely to have been drawing said Karma Portals when these new locations were added, especially after the conclusion of the main series in 2015. There are other examples of this process being carried out, mostly in Submachine universe, but every so often in changes made to the main games as well, and I'll put them on the screen here if you'd like to pause and read about them. But there's a much bigger example, one actually as big as an entire game in the series itself. In 2014, the spin-off game Submachine Future Loop Foundation was remastered, taking what was previously a small side project developed in part to promote some of the music for the real-world music project Future Loop Foundation, and removing all references to anything not created by Mateusz Skutnik, as well as adding new puzzles, drawing nicer looking graphics, and rebranding simply to Submachine FLF. No in-universe explanation is given for why the game is called FLF, so that just sticks around. Plus, Mateusz decided to promote the game as a fifth layer version of what happened in the original, borrowing a piece of world building introduced in Submachine 8. The ending message of FLF now lightly teases the upcoming Submachine 10 at the time, where previously it teased the upcoming Submachine 5 at the time. So again, there's some weird, temporal conceptual stuff being created here, simply as a result of Mateusz wanting the development of the project to be folded right back into the project. So that's the big stuff that I want you to take from Submachine. Big concepts, themes, happenings that kept me coming back year after year. And at the end of it, all I have to say personally is that the conjunction of all these things really just spoke to me and inspired me. It spoke to my developing appreciation for architecture, peering into some of the deepest science fiction concepts I had read about at the time, gave me the opportunity to flex my creative muscles, exposed me to some really cool geometry-based art, and also provided a community of people to share a special niche interest with. I can't really praise the community enough, who was with me as we anticipated the release of new chapters in the series, put together fun forum games to play, bared all the ups and downs of being a small community in a remote place on the internet where everyone knows each other. We got sick of each other every so often, as you do. But it was a great place for belonging, especially as someone who didn't fit in with others either socially or mentally. Looking back on it now, it really was a textbook imagining of having some of my friends in the computer, and I got to either call or meet them in person, the ones that I grew closest to, and I'm really thankful for it. Submachine has given me a lot, and even if the momentum of that community eventually died down over time, people around the world were still eagerly waiting for what a full remaster of Submachine would bring. Even though Slice of Sea was released 2 years earlier, meaning that Mateusz Skutnik had already broken through from being known as a game developer that just worked on Flash games and individual EXEs to a bona fide indie developer on Steam, we were still waiting to see this series properly come alive in full HD quality, unfettered by Flash's technical limitations, incorporating all of Mateusz's signature graphical and interactive elements, and of course, new places to explore in the subnet, as promised. So with that short introduction to Submachine out of the way, what do I think about Submachine Legacy? What's different? What do I like? What do I dislike? The full list of changes I noted down and had thoughts about would not fit inside this entire YouTube channel, and maybe I'll make that list available at some point down the road if you'd like to read absolutely everything, more or less. This will be a condensed version of all of that. Let's start at the beginning. Right from the very first screen, we have a lot to talk about. I'll be honest, I originally had mixed feelings about seeing this full-screen entrance to Submachine for the first time after so many years. The original game set up this narrative of you as a player becoming not just a player of video games, but the player, as you were immersed in the first game, escaping it in that classic room escape fashion only to find that the journey has just begun. It was a potent storyline that has all basically been wiped away because now we have these beautiful hand-drawn entrance shots, making it very clear that we know exactly where the subnet is. Underground in the desert, seemingly from beginning to end. And it seems like we're already knowingly participating in an expedition, maybe scientific in nature, or maybe spiritual. This is really disorienting. The mysterious world from yesterdecade is now much more grounded and a lot less mysterious. I was just expecting it to start more or less as the original started, maybe even in a small size close to the original 300 pixel square measurement before opening up to the promised near 1080p full size when walking down the hallway into Chapter 2. Just a little bit headcanon. I feel bad that new Submachine players won't experience that same immersion in the way that I and others did. And it changes even more. When we exit Chapter 1, we immediately spill out into the behind-the-scenes area that was only revealed to us in Submachine 10. We no longer venture forth directly into the concealed karma portal here. Instead, the new path is off to the left and up a ladder, through which we can now access Chapter 2. I think I'm still recovering from this, to be honest, even though it's been over a year. Everything inside me immediately said, no, this is not right. He screwed up. This is not how it's supposed to be. But of course, I'm still curious as to how this might come back around later, so obviously I'm going to keep playing. Turns out it doesn't really come back around in a special way. This is just how Submachine is now. I mean, technically it does come back around because, we still come back here at the end of Chapter 10, and we see that time has passed and the screen is broken, so we can see how we originally got into the lighthouse. Except, wait a minute, that's not the way that we got into the lighthouse anymore, is it? We didn't come out the same way that we came in. Huh. And, at this point, at the end of my first playthrough, I didn't really know what to make of that. Let's talk about other world-building things. A second huge change to the world building comes from being able to now peer into the void. Not only do we now know we're underground, we also can see out the windows and observe these dimly lit dark blue structures and sandbanks and bioluminescent flora in the far distance. There is no longer as huge an air of mystery about where we are because there are so many new waypoints to help us get our footing. Also, locations with notably unique backgrounds that suggested we might actually be back at the surface approaching civilization, or out in some distant nebula elsewhere in the universe, are completely scrapped. The signature void that gives no answers is still present everywhere that's not peering out a window, but the elusive nature of Submachine is quickly becoming resolved. And I'm of two minds as to how I feel about it. Whereas previously Submachine introduced us with so many unknowns that we couldn't even tell whether a location surrounded by void was suspended in the air, or in space, or underground in a cavern with walls so far away that no light could reach them and the sense of being inside or outside doesn't really seem to matter, we can make more reasonable guesses now. I don't really like having the answers. I think I prefer that the unknown stays unknown. When it's unknown, it could be anything. And with a series built so much on fear and intrigue of the unknown, I do wonder if a core thing that made it unique is now being undercut. But that being said, I also think that an argument is to be made that having some sense of bearings on your landscape every so often can actually do more to further the intrigue about the parts that you still cannot see. We can see the ground now, and we can see the defense system stretch into the distance. But we're still underground, keep in mind. How can a cave this big exist under the surface of the Earth? How did it get to be like that? How is it physically possible? What is beyond the hill with the trees, where their weak light runs out? I've thought about this for long enough that I think it's possible to see a better balance between the known and the unknown here, in the same way that an SCP entry would be pretty boring to read if everything was redacted. Everything was redacted. In a similar way, this new Submachine world can be even more exciting with the scraps that we have now been given. A third big change to the world building in Submachine Legacy is a seemingly minor point with huge implications, and that is the presence of all 7 layers of reality in every single one of the chapters. Previously, the only chapters where we explored the subnet in 7 different layers were Submachines 8 and 9, possibly 10 as well, though that's a bit unclear. And the sneak peeks that we got into locations from the other games made it clear that there was nothing to be found in other layers. But now, with the late game ability to travel to any chapter in the series and explore it in any layer that you want, which you have to do in order to achieve the true ending, all of the subnet exists now in all of the layers, thereby voiding the special property that made the not what it was. On its face, it might not be a big deal that multiple layers exist everywhere now, because we originally found out in Sub 10 that each main layer is made out of an uncountably infinite number of sublayers, and a new piece of lore added to Legacy says that, people in the subnet phase into them as soon as they start using portal technology, which is why you never run into anyone else anywhere. But it has huge implications for the properties of karma energy, which makes up the karma portals we see drawn everywhere, and which act as wormholes puncturing through the different layers to transport people. For the longest time, it was more or less assumed that blue karma portals were only present on one layer, and green ones were present in all layers, like what we saw in Submachine 9. But now, all blue karma portals in the entire game are accessible from every layer, because all the layers are everywhere now. Oh, I'm sorry. That's not true. I just thought about that. Some of the secret karma portals are only available in one layer, the ones that you need to access the secret locations in each chapter. So some of the blue karma portals are only existent in one layer, but others are existent in all of them. There's an inconsistency there, isn't there? It's one of those times where, as understanding as I try to be, I did think that this was an example of Mataush making a change that actually broke the game world in a pretty big way. The logic for how these are supposed to work now doesn't really make sense. Now, I'm sure we can have an extended discussion in the comments as to whether the appearance of different types of karma energy relates well with the layers or not, using separate comments Mataush has made about treating different karma portal colors like different bandwidths of karma traffic and all that. But the bigger thing that this change to include all layers in all the games made me realize is that these chapters are starting to be treated less as distinct points in time and more as separate locations to be explored. Unless we're to be seen as time travelers ourselves, which would explain how we can jump back and forth between the basement exit shown in one state at the end of Sub 1 versus another state at the end of Sub 10, as previously mentioned. But if we don't assume that, then I'm kind of left with the assumption that visiting these chapters feels more like gathering the information that we need from different stops on a tour of Submachine itself. We'll come back to this. Finally, a fourth big change to the world building comes from the clear influence that Slice of Sea has had on the development of this game. The involvement of the hand-drawn scenery with the blue-shifted Slice of Sea color palette and the brief reference to a scene in Slice of Sea shown in the transition between chapters 8 and 9 make it unmistakable. Mataush is determined to make his properties rub elbows with each other, despite repeated affirmations that Slice of Sea is in the Daymare Town universe, and Submachine is in its own world, and Covert Front is in its own world. It's not really surprising, though, to see Daymare Town and Submachine so intimately close to each other, given that Slice of Sea has references to basically every property that Mataush has had complete creative control over. And I think that game was used as a developing ground for Mataush to really try to perfect his creative style and overall look. Personally, I'm convinced that this shot we see of thresholds and gateways, portals to who knows where, is a sort of worlds between worlds where a transition during a particularly volatile moment of portal transfer allows us to glimpse the potential for many other creative ideas that Mataush has made, or has contemplated making. It allows us to peek behind the curtain. There's strong branding going on here for the aesthetic of Mataush Skutnik, and I appreciate the tie-in, but I also would be lying if I didn't mention that I worry about the aesthetic of Submachine itself being lost a bit in the process. One could easily see Submachine as the most mechanical or technical of Mataush Skutnik's different creative aesthetics. There's no watercolor, no digital brush strokes in the same style as Covert Front, no color scheme and bare-bones minimalism of the classic Daymare Town, no cutesy characters from his smaller games to have to deal with. This is a land of machinery, rudimentary geometry, buildings that stand resolute, and devices of all kinds. Every sound screams of the tangible machine, and the background music is subdued but powerful in delivering this message of physical human creation. But a lot of the new sounds we hear carry this more heightened, active sense of wonder and cues of mindful ponderance and adventure that sound more like they stepped off the altar of Slice of Sea, looking to carry a full conversation with me, instead of, crawling out of the pile of broken metal beams and chair legs of Submachine to ask for their scraps or deliver their message and withdraw promptly. And try as I might, I can't peacefully resolve all of it internally. I don't like playing with the new item pickup and usage sounds, especially after having to hear the former overlap itself time after time if I pick up a bunch of items at once. I'd rather have the old screechy sound of the beam between chapters 4 and 5 back instead of this spiritual beam journey that ends up in lighting up a section, not just lighting up, enlightening up, as if we've approached the highest point of the secluded sacred temple. It's a lab dormitory. Where are all the bells and chimes coming from? It's interesting how much of this shift of aesthetic is driven by the sound design, which I assume Mateusz directly collaborated with Thumpmonks on to bring to light. Many of the new pieces of music we hear are really pushing into slice of sea territory, with some classic themes like the perfectly callous and mechanically foreboding loop even being directly reinterpreted to fit into this new air of adventure and discovery, something that feels important, something that is a far cry from the simple synths, drones, and mechanical effects that peppered the original game soundtracks. It really makes me feel like exploring the Lovecraftian horror of the subnet has never been so much fun. It's not Submachine, is it? It doesn't exactly feel like it, right? While we're talking about the slice of sound, Submachine Legacy does not have enough sound effects. Full stop. The sound effects used for all of the item interactions are repeated constantly between different uses. Most power-up moments will use one of two sounds, for example. This is important because one of the things that I really anticipated seeing in each new Submachine game is not just how each installment brought us a unique new environment to explore and new items to use, and sometimes even new puzzle mechanics, but it's all colored by largely unique sounds that you can associate with each game. But now in Submachine Legacy, the sound design has largely been flattened between all of the chapters, so that the sounds package is tied to basically none of them. It's worth noting that Thumpmonks designed all the sounds heard in the game this time because Mateusz was determined to make this game a completely two-person project without having to rely on sounds downloaded from the internet. And I have a feeling that Thumpmonks simply just did not make enough sounds. Maybe Mateusz just thought that what he was given was enough to work with, but I wish there were more. The games don't sound individually special anymore. But to be fair, I don't want to be a complete downer on this point. Most of the new sound effects do fit in one place or another pretty well, even if they're being stretched to fit into 4 or 5 different settings, for objects made of different materials and having different configurations and uses. I actually really like the new sounds for the room transition and the jump cut, probably because they fit exactly into this idea that I have of what a good Submachine sound is, informed by machinery and a non-overstated presence. Someone could argue that because they're new, it sucks that the default sound is not the OG kathunk, which is arguably the most iconic sound of Submachine, but personally, I am used to the new one. The old one was brash and low quality, and you could argue to the moon and back about how it's really not that big of a deal if the graphics or sound quality are not at their peak for a game to be considered one of someone's greatest of all time, and how so much of the charm can actually come directly from these features, like a lot of people will argue for games like Super Mario 64 or Half-Life. In this case, I think these new sounds fit a new Submachine perfectly. And while we're at it, let's revisit the idea that the ambiences are getting too complex, too open and bombastic, too melodic. This was not Submachine for the longest time. Until Submachine 8 The Plan came out, and then Submachine 9 The Temple really changed things up with ambience built around chords, and even beats culminating in literal drum beats and music reminiscent of a movie trailer when we descended the giant Shiva statue. People in the community recognized how much of a departure Submachine 9 in particular was from the established Submachine style, both due to the music choices, but also the environment that really broke Submachine into the realm of high mindfulness and discussions of spirituality. Some people didn't like it, but I did. We've come a long way since research teams. We're now dealing with gods and the magical substance of karma directly, and Submachine 10 followed the trend as well, giving us more ornate environments and more complex compositions that seem to be designed to be looked at and appreciated just as much as used. Submachine has always evolved from game to game. With the last few installments in the main series, it just evolved in different ways than we had seen previously. So similarly, there is an argument to be made that this evolution to a style closer to that of the Mateusz overall aesthetic is just the next area that the subnet has expanded to absorb. We'll come back to this, but for now I'll say that the overall idea of this new context for the world building is one that I can get along with. I still wish there were more sound effects though. And visually, most of the graphics are still the Submachine style. They are only changed drastically in the aforementioned view shots or transitions between chapters. The only other significant changes appear in the forms of some extra details drawn in different rooms and devices that need it, and also those mysterious little green lights that are popping up everywhere. We'll talk more about those later as well. Let's move on to talking about changes in the story. Interestingly enough, no big changes have been made to the original story. There have been some additions to the original story that are pretty significant, but the base story itself is relatively untouched. So for the most part, people who are still slaving away at trying to make that perfect Submachine story explained video on YouTube won't have two conflicting versions of events to really tell, which I suppose is nice. The largest change to the base story by far is that Murtaugh is now recast as a figure that purposefully went to the waterfall in Kent Falls on a pilgrimage journey instead of being seen as someone who just happened to go camping and stumble on the waterfall and get injured in the catalyst for the entire saga. This is significant because it really wraps up how the Submachine now from beginning to end is all about a planned journey on behalf of Murtaugh, and now us as well, that again harkens to some idea of deliberation and not just somewhere that people found themselves. Murtaugh also has lost his edge a bit in the sense that he was previously characterized as an individual that was sometimes cold and neglectful of his followers and the people that worked under him, and then explicitly revengeful when it came to his invasion of the core. But now he's a bit more gracious in his actions. He tells the defense system that it can rest now when he disables it, and his wording in other sections lends more credence to the idea that he was more misunderstood in his actions rather than being an explicit antagonist. I can't help but notice that this follows a wider trend that Mateusz has demonstrated through both Submachine and his development process for the remaster of Daymare Town. He's been careful to remove some of the nastier things you can find in these games. Murtaugh in Submachine is now not as vengeful and cold, a reference to suicide has been removed, and in Daymare Town another grisly suicide is being removed for the remaster, I think, as well as some other disgusting things that I think are actually perfect for capturing this idea that you never know what sort of effed up stuff you're going to be finding in these indie flash games on the internet. But, I guess Mateusz wants his worlds to be just a touch more positive, generally speaking. Another change to the base story, is the removal of several of the special messages in the intros and outros of some of these games. Much more prevalent in the early games in the series, these messages address the player directly and hype them up for the game they're playing, or offer short soliloquies from the in-game player about what they're thinking about being caught up in the secret world. The placement of these only really makes sense when you are not playing these games as chapters with one immediately following the other, but instead are waiting anywhere from a few months to a year or two between different games in the series. There's something afforded from simply having a break between chapters to discuss in the community what everyone had just played and what is coming next that adds to the sense of time in the complete journey that is necessarily compressed in Submachine Legacy. Again, this idea of this other sense of a temporal dimension that we should be keeping track of is poking through, and this is reinforced by Shattered Quadrant, the reimagining of Submachine universe that is also included in Legacy. Years ago, when Mateusz was focused on releasing paid HD versions of each individual Flash game, he pondered what would eventually happen to Submachine Universe, and what he would need to do to turn a game so full of other people's contributions into a game that had strictly his own stuff in it. I pointed out at the time that I wondered if and how Mateusz would be able to replicate one of my favorite parts of Submachine Universe, which was, as mentioned previously, the real-world wait time of 7 years that it took for the game's scope to grow from 50 locations to 130, via over 40 different updates. As we can see in Legacy, Mateusz's final answer to that question was to just include all of the locations from the start, and completely avoid capturing that aspect of the game's experience. So it's lost to time forever. You just had to be there. I realize that these two examples are examples where the sense of marriage of real-world time and Submachine time is not really demonstrated, mostly because the time aspects are being deleted. But the big example in Legacy where this is demonstrated is the multiple new references to the Architect and to the new concept of the shifts. This is where everything properly comes back around, because Legacy is filled with sketches that Mateusz made while in architecture school, and it's very clear that Mateusz is using the architect as a sort of stand-in character for himself, with multiple references to how his studies as an architect eventually informed his game design, as well as some of Mateusz's own personal musings on the importance of artists being dedicated to their craft, and some of his inspirations for some of the motifs we see in the entire series, like lighthouses and the number 32. It's also worth noting that these discussions about the architect and the explanations for some of the concepts that we've always wondered about are taking place between two unnamed people that we've presumably been hearing from all the way back in Submachine 8, a master and a disciple, with the former imparting knowledge of the subnet of years or perhaps decades onto this eager mind wanting to learn more. It is so incredibly obvious to me how much Mateusz loves this idea of carrying out a story of the perpetual explorer who loves to explore the unknown and interact with systems of vast knowledge, and he has beautifully intertwined this into not just the story of Submachine, but again, the story of the development of Submachine inside the Submachine universe as well. And that just leaves the notion of the new concept of the shift. We see questions about why some items that do not really fit the aesthetic of the game that they're found in having failed to shift away, and this can be explained by the previously demonstrated fact that Mateusz is trying to preserve as many of the things that made Submachine special as possible. The shift returns in the historical location 438, which is my favorite since this room was created using one of my Submachine fan arts I designed years ago as a basis. A plate on the wall references the fact that the architect drawing found here is part of the post-Shift 2 era, thereby implying that post-Shift 1 references the storage cabinet that I had originally drawn in this location. And also it suggests a usage further back in the Submachine timeline, or maybe the real-world timeline, as well as a future point in time where the location is non-existent. Maybe this is a recognition that Submachine cannot exist forever because at some point the Steam servers will be shut down and all computers will return to dust. But hey, that's just a theory. The shift is mentioned again in the one theory left in Shattered Quadrant, built out of the rubble of Submachine Universe. It's a new theory, but we cannot read the bulk of its contents. The writer mentions that a shift happened, and I can only imagine that they're wondering why Submachine Universe is now Shattered Quadrant, if they're even capable of grasping the context in which they really exist. Clearly, the shift concept is the idea of committing the development process to Submachine's heart. It's the canonization of the progression of Submachine's real-world history, in a way that is slightly warped and open to interpretation, but it's there all the same, and part of the Submachine world's history forever. I can't fully grasp how beautiful of a thing it is that Mateusz has been so reflective and loving of his own work that he has decided to inscribe a love letter to itself within itself, and then allowed us to experience it too. The question of whether the writer of the last theory is starting to understand that they're inside a game that has been constantly pored over by thousands of prying eyes and redrawn and redeveloped by a singular developer also makes me ask another question. If Shattered Quadrant is just the next evolution of Submachine Universe, then is Submachine Legacy, as a whole, not in fact the singular true Submachine experience, but just the latest evolution of the concept that includes the line of HD versions and original standard definition versions found on websites back in the day. Given everything that we've seen, I cannot see it any other way. And if we assume that to be true, then it is much easier to recontextualize this latest version from being not just a version that's spruced up and more marketable for consumers on a gaming platform, where Mateusz gets to go wild with decorating it with a sense of adventure, of a grand journey, and doesn't worry as much as to why the layers and karma portals and stuff don't exactly jive with each other anymore, but instead as the latest chapter itself in the Submachine story, one that is a celebration of everything that came before it, where you can embark on the journey surrounded with hints of things that used to exist differently, and allow you to probe deeper and perhaps look further back in time, uncover more history as you seek out the older versions for answers to lingering questions that you may have. And when you do, I think you'll begin to understand why you see the green lights in all of these different places. Look at what has changed between the Legacy version and the versions that came before, and you'll realize that the lights have a very high correlation with significant changes that were made by the subnet to prepare itself for Legacy's arrival. Even though Mateusz Skutnik himself tells people that Submachine Legacy is the version of Submachine that they should play if they're new to the series, I don't believe that's the only thing that he wants. I think he wants to keep the door open so that others are invited to experience everything that he has had to give over the course of 20 years of developing these games. He has been so committed to sharing the worlds that he's created and the stories that he's told, and to understand and appreciate it fully is to seek out all of it. And I am so thankful that I got to experience it and be part of the conversation, and to have it be part of the conversation of my own life as well. There really has been nothing like it. And with that, I think I've said what I needed to say about what I think about Submachine Legacy and Submachine broadly. There are more things I could talk about that I should mention briefly before I wrap up. I didn't talk about the changes to the puzzles at all because this video is long enough as is, but I did want to mention that I personally actually had a bit of an active role in the redesign of these puzzles. I reached out to Mateusz in good nature while the game was being developed, using my status as prominent guy in the community to make suggestions for improving a lot of the puzzles to make them more accessible and a bit more intuitive for first-time viewers. I thank Mateusz for being gracious enough to allow me to send him my suggestions, and I also want to make clear that at the end of the day, he's the developer who decides what to sign off on for his own game, so all the credits for changes go to him. I'll make that document available for extra reading, possibly including Mateusz's comments on my suggestions as well, if you want to read those. I really like some of what came out of this process, and there are also some things that frustrated me to no end, if I'm being honest. Like, for example, it is extremely frustrating how every time you have to use a key in Submachine Legacy, this hint system shows you a little picture of the key, or the hammer, or the karmic vessel, or any item that you need in certain situations that is either so obvious as to be supremely redundant, or a situation that just solves the puzzle for you immediately. I think it's a really bad addition to the game, but I'm also 99% sure I know exactly why he added this. Come find me in the comments for the answer. I could also talk about other trivial things too, like how I have issues with how there are certain locations missing that make Mateusz's claim that every location he's ever drawn in Submachine history being in Legacy untrue, or how the official soundtrack has naming issues and also is not really complete as is suggested by the Submachine Complete title, and how I've actually been discussing with Thumpmonks how to make a better, more detailed and expanded Submachine Complete Soundtrack 2.0. You know, just little things like that. Again, come find me in the comments if you're interested. If you've made it through this entire video, I thank you so much for hearing what I have to say. I hope you understand fully why I went to the lengths that I did in making this, and it's because I think it's important that we understand each other better through the deeply intimate experiences we have with each other's artistic creations. This is not time that I take for granted. I've been very happy with the fact that I've spent my time gaming by exploring stories and worlds that really mean something to me and that give me things to think about and appreciate, and treat my time as precious and not just wasting countless hours doing the same thing over and over with minimal engagement because I have nothing better that I want to do. I wish I could give the Submachine Legacy treatment to every game that I've ever played. It would be respecting the games much more than a simple review could ever do, and it's light years ahead of some of what passes for engaging dialogue about games these days. Please avoid looking into alternate timeline where I review Submachine by saying, this is a game about how a white man is the bad guy and he has to be rescued by a time-traveling biracial woman before he destroys everything. Therefore, the game is bad because it's woke. 0 out of 10. Next game, please. Hopefully, in the future, we can be a bit more serious about how we're spending our time. That's all I have for you. Thank you so much for watching.